Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of One Vision, the Fintech Fuse. Welcome back. Ooh, what a summer it has been. This is Theo, your host for the episode. Now, joining us today as we kick off the rest of the year is Cleve Mesidor, Executive Director of the Blockchain Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit leading an industry-wide crypto education campaign and also a fellow DC neighbor. DC, I'm using it very liberally. Metro DC. Welcome to the show, Cleve.
Thank you for having me. And it's always nice to be among another fellow person in the DMV, the DC, Maryland, Virginia area.
Yes, I know. It's fascinating. And thinking back, 5 years running the show, most of the people I've had on the show are either in a different country, different continent, and in a different city. So I don't often have the pleasure to have someone from the area, from our backyard. So thank you for joining me today. Let's start up with the foundation. I know that the Blockchain Foundation recently is commemorating 2 years of service. So tell us a little bit more about how the foundation started and what are you focusing on right now?
Yeah, the foundation was created in 2018, but it primarily stayed dormant but compliant, with all of the filings. And we relaunched it in January 20 in the spring of 2023. No, 2022, sorry. We
Time
relaunched
flies.
it. I know. It's already 2 years. So and why? Because the Blockchain Foundation is the sister entity to the Blockchain Association, which is the largest advocacy group for crypto in Washington, D.C. Though two separate organizations, they are intertwined. On our board of directors is Kristen Smith, who's the CEO of the Blockchain Association. But Blockchain Foundation is a 501c3. And, over the years, I've been collaborating with the Blockchain Association since 2019. And during COVID and in 2021, we recognized that we needed a platform to engage the institutions that Washington trusts, right? Advocacy groups, nonprofits, the institutions with large stakeholders and large constituencies. Those organizations primarily can only collaborate with a 501c3. So I like to tell people while the industry is focused on adoption, Blockchain Foundation is focusing on education and access.
Which I love because those are the things that even beyond the blockchain community, right? That's what we need is educating, getting people familiar with what we have, right? And then getting them access and so that they can use it and use it responsibly. So that is in relation to a research report that I spotted. The foundation released on digital assets and credit unions.
Yeah.
I have to admit, the first time I saw it, I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, what is going on here? I was very curious. So tell us a little bit more about why that was a research topic that you wanted to embark on, and tell us more about the research report and what you've learned.
Yeah, so this is our second report. The first report for Blockchain Foundation was last year, where we focused on financial literacy education. Our report made the case that we need to standardize and codify financial literacy education in high schools across all 50 states. But we also said that digital assets should be part of that conversation, that we need to educate young people for the future of money and the future of commerce. So we're excited that this year's report that we just launched focuses on the institutions that the earliest and largest adopters of blockchain and cryptocurrency trust. The data overwhelmingly shows that the earliest and continues to be the largest adopters of cryptocurrency are working class people, young people, communities of color. These are the people that still actually frequent credit unions, minority banks, and community banks, right? So these institutions that we know that haven't had the attention or the resources that they needed, we think that they are in the best position to offer risk mitigation services along with the purchase of cryptocurrency. So when you look at all of the concerns around consumer protection and protecting market participants, right? We know large banks are not going to require it necessarily for purchase, but for the working class people, the young people, the people in rural communities, who go frequent, community banks, credit unions, and minority banks, these institutions know who their patrons are. They can help them when there's a fraud issue or a scam issue. So we believe that, they need to be, they need the authority to offer digital assets. But in the paper, we recognize the challenges that these institutions face, right? They are still existing in the 20th century, let alone, the 21st century. We need to provide infrastructure. They need capital. We need to make sure that they can provide fintechs as well as digital assets. So the paper is realistic that, there's a lot of work to be done to get them to the place where they can even, engage in this playing field. But we also make the case that if federal regulators are serious about consumer protection, these institutions, as well as the BNY Mellons and the JP Morgans, who all have received authority to engage on digital assets in one way or the other, we need to make sure the institutions that everyday people trust and frequent also have the capacity as well.
That's a really good point because, as much as we talk about how financial institutions need to modernize infrastructure, provide different kinds of services to consumers, reality is that if you're a smaller institution with less assets, it's harder to do so because you don't have the resources, right? So in that sense, what role do you think community banks and credit unions can play when we say, we need to level the playing field so that they can do something for their constituents in decentralized finance? How can they even adapt?
They have to adapt, but they have to adapt from a regulatory perspective. One of the challenges for them, to get into the 21st century has been compliance. One, when you look at these various institutions, the regulatory oversight is all over the place, whether it's NCUA, the Fed, FDIC, the OCC. We need to streamline that process, right? But also, in order for them to meet the needs of today's retail investor or consumer, right? As you mentioned, we need to make sure that they can meet those needs. But whose needs are we talking about, right? Today, we have 5 generations participating in the financial system, right? Who are looking at banking needs. And they're all different, right? Boomers, Gen Xers like myself, millennials, Gen Z, and even people under 13 Gen Alpha, we all have different needs. So therefore, we definitely need a dynamic banking system, but we have to recognize that we need to make sure all financial institutions can, offer the different services and access points that consumers need. So I think there was a time when we thought, we're moving towards a place where it's just going to be one thing or the other. Everything's going to be digital and no one's going to go to banks anymore. But we've seen generations bring back, record players, right? They're bringing back libraries and unions. And these institutions, we have 2 generations that are saying that they want these traditional institutions back. So, it is up to not just the federal government, because the capital they will need to come through oversight from the federal government for them so they could seek some resources, but also the partnerships that they need to fund to find to actually do some of this stuff. They're going to need regulatory authority to do them as well. So there's a lot of work to do to make sure that these institutions can provide and meet the needs of the 21st century retail investor, consumer, and household.
That's a very good point that you just raised. I'm taking notes, but the fact that you highlighted there are 5 generations of people, right, using the banking system. And I love your point about the younger generation going back a little bit, looking for traditions. And it reminds me of my daughter. For the last 2 weeks, she has been petitioning for a camera. Not taking pictures with the phone, but a camera, a proper camera. And I'm like, really? People do that still? There was a reason why we all moved towards the iPhone, but she's like, no, I need a proper camera. It's fascinating to see. And just last week, they ordered their first CD. CD. See, I'm like, we don't have means to play the CD at home, like a physical CD. Now I have 3 of those outside. I'm like, I don't know what to do with it. But it's fascinating, and I did remember reading a study about people wanting to go back to talking to people, which is
Yeah.
great, right? That's how you and I connected. I remember in Barbados we were talking. Um, Hooray to tradition. So,
But also, not to interrupt, but one thing I've seen come back as well from what I've read, is young people are bringing back notebooks and pens and pencils. Like there was
yes.
a time we thought they would just want to type everything on their PDA, but no, kids are bringing back that old notebook and pen.
That is actually the one thing with back to school shopping we did. That's the one thing we spend the most on was notebook and pens and pencils. There's so many of them. We had 3 visits to the stationery store. That's how crazy it is. But it's good. I love. I still have pens and notebook. That's how I remember things. I don't know. There's something to writing that makes things more personal. So I'm all for it. But let me ask you this. So let's turn the conversation around. We're talking about traditions. We're talking about, a little bit mixing of old and new. And you have something new that just started. It's a new studio called Butterscotch Media. Now, I love dessert. So when you first told me about the name Butterscotch, I'm like, oh, yay, ice cream, Sunday. I'm sure there's more to it. So tell us a little bit more about where did the inspiration from the name come from, and what is Butterscotch Media?
Yes, yes. It's actually an interesting story. So, Butterscotch Media is a digital news platform focused exclusively on inclusion in Web3 and DeFi. I've been working in this space for over 6 years, and I've noticed that over the years, there's a lack of coverage about the earliest and largest adopters of cryptocurrency. As I've shared, the data overwhelmingly shows that the earliest and largest adopters are Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous. Even the crypto voter everyone keeps talking about, the data shows that profile is urban, right, diverse, leans democratic. But when you look at the traditional media, when you even look at the various Web3 media outlets, and even when you look at Washington and the hearings, right, you see no diversity, no inclusion. But this $2 trillion market was fueled by communities of color, innovators, builders, startup founders. So I noticed a gap and decided to fill it. I'm following that old model of political axios, even Punchbowl. And so Butterscotch Media includes a newsletter, a weekly newsletter, a podcast, as well as live events. So, where did the name come from? Obviously, again, I'm exclusively focused on inclusion in blockchain cryptocurrency. But how do I say that? And as I was thinking about what to name this, I remembered a Netflix documentary, well, a Netflix series that I loved. It was called The Get Down, and it was about hip hop and the early days in the Bronx. And they had this, fictitious character. It was 2 high school students, and the high school guy, was in love with the girl, who was in the building, and it was a young, teenage Black guy in love with a Latina in his building, and he wrote her a poem called "My Butterscotch Queen," and I, for some reason, that always stuck with me. And I knew that he was looking butterscotch to capture the diversity, right? So for me, when you look at the ingredients of butterscotch, like whether it be, butter, molasses, or brown sugar, it encompasses that diversity. And of course, when it came to calling our podcast, we called it the Get Down. But but it's really about, making sure that we're celebrating inclusion within the Web3 and DeFi space, but also telling these stories. These stories are important, right? And I think we can build more trust, not just with the public, but with policymakers, if they would see more diverse builders, founders, entrepreneurs, even small businesses that are engaging in this ecosystem.
I like that. I was going to ask you why the podcast was called To Get Down. Now I know. That is too cute. I didn't even research. I should have looked on the ingredients for butterscotch. I just always take it for granted. It's yummy. It comes in a jar, and you spread it, and it worked. But I love the story. Um, you know what? You should have told that on stage. When we were in Barbados. I mean, think about that, right? Molasses and sugar and all of that. Barbados was all about sugar cane. And it's
Exactly.
sweet and it's happy. It makes people happy. Diversity, inclusion, charting a new course in financial world. That is something to celebrate about. So we are more than halfway through 2024. I can't believe it. What has surprised you the most in Web3 and the blockchain world so far?
Well, a few things have surprised me, but I think most has been the number of institutional players coming into the space. As I've mentioned, I first learned about, crypto when I was serving in the Obama administration in 2013. A friend had a Bitcoin project and asked me to help with a press release. And so that's what took me down the rabbit hole. And in 2016, I decided to leave politics, and starting spring 2017, I've been working full time in this space. So for me, I love the crypto native space where we are really focused on decentralization, where we're actually building a new financial system without centralized parties, without, the over reliance on intermediaries. And so, you know, I definitely noticed over the years a lot of the larger companies started forming partnerships with traditional financial institutions. The very traditional financial institutions, in my opinion, that have locked people out, that have locked out, people from urban communities, from rural communities, people who, socioeconomic status, did not meet their needs. So I've been surprised by how much institutional, grab, how much of an institutional grab there's been of crypto. When you look at, the Bitcoin spot ETF, and most recently the Ethereum spot ETF, the players that are benefiting most are your BlackRocks, right? Are your Fidelities, are all of these traditional institutions. And then another thing that has surprised me is, when it comes to Washington and policymakers in Washington, right? We've tried to share the drumbeat that, they're over focused on consumer protection without also focusing on financial inclusion measures and capital formation, proposals, continues to lack out people of color, right? And so, and that's what we've seen. People of color are the earliest and largest adapters, but every time policy comes around, it just punishes these communities, these diverse innovators. Let's be honest, right? If you're a large multi-million-dollar company, whatever regulations, Washington can come at you with, you have attorneys to deal with them. But in the blind spot of Washington has been the vibrant ecosystem of entrepreneurs and builders and innovators who are paying the price for you know, their reliance on, a centralized system. So, but I will say, just this is a free market society. We knew that this space would grow. We've seen, the impact, even when you look at the price of Bitcoin. You know, After the last halving, there was a sense that the price would go up in the way that it has in the past. And I think what a lot of people didn't factor in was how many institutional players are now in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So we now see the price of Bitcoin is very aligned with what traditional finance is, right? So much for the hedge of protection, right? Hedge against inflation, I should say. But when you look at right now, we're seeing, the traditional stock market and financial system, suffering quite a bit, and it's reflected in the price of cryptocurrencies. So we have to move forward. The space is growing, absolutely. We're still at the starting line, but it has been disappointing that for those of us who came here for decentralization, who wanted to build a new financial system that was accessible to everyone, it's too often it's looking more and more like traditional finance, and more and more traditional finance are the ones benefiting.
I could almost port that same narrative to technology innovation in general, right? Every time when we think we're coming up with something that we are helping to bring the world together, to bring people that we have forgotten in the last innovation into the fold, we end up repeating, unfortunately, the same story. We saw that with internet, we saw that with Web 2. And I'm afraid we're seeing it with AI as well, right? Those who can afford to experiment, those that can afford, to get the data, to train the models, which they're both expensive, and to see what sticks, right? All of those, unfortunately, are the same big tech companies that have benefited from the last internet innovation cycle. So more work to be done, definitely, in a very, very busy 2024, no less. So speaking of, what's keeping you busy now? And any predictions that you have for the rest of the year? I almost feel exhausted thinking about, what do you mean rest of the year? I had no idea what the first half of the year went. And now, of course, we're like in a never ending. I'm hoping for one day we can actually have a quiet day. Remember those? We used to have like a quiet day, no news.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't get those anymore. Every day there's something.
Yeah. Well, I live in Washington, and and I worked in Washington politics, served in the Obama administration, worked in Congress. There was a time when August was quiet in Washington,
Yes.
where folks left Washington, politics was silent, but that's not the case. And it's not just because this is a presidential year. Policy and politics are looming. And, for me, that's what's keeping me busy and keeping me up at night. Obviously, I am a Democrat, as I shared, having worked in the Obama administration, but worked for Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California. I even worked for, Congresswoman Betty McCollum from Minnesota. And, the VP has just announced Tim Walz from Minnesota as her VP choice. And obviously, for me, it's more about policy than politics. As a Democrat, I'm encouraged that Kamala Harris is the nominee and Biden actually stepped back. But I'm also, going to hold VP Harris accountable as she runs for the presidency. So I'm absolutely going to support her. But to date, as I shared earlier, most of the policy proposals have been focused on consumer protection and nothing on financial inclusion and capital formation. So I actually recently hosted a Zoom meeting with Web3 and DeFi, leaders and innovators and builders to express support for her. But we talked about the importance of policies to foster inclusion in Web3 and DeFi. We're talking about access to capital for entrepreneurs, like workforce training, incentives for technological infrastructure for small businesses. This needs to be part of the conversation. Yeah, we need to talk about Gensler and, his role at the SEC. But if we talk about getting rid of Gensler and don't talk about, the need for more access to capital for entrepreneurs, we don't talk about workforce training as this $2 trillion market grows, then that's a failure for me. So, between now and the election, I'm really focused on that. I'm actually heading to Martha's Vineyard. This is the second year we'll be bringing blockchain to the vineyard in August when Black political leaders gather. So we can have this conversation about inclusive policymaking and inclusive rulemaking. We need to make sure that, we're not creating the next big tech that's not inclusive, where people cannot participate. And we can only do that if we hold administrations accountable. Biden's administration didn't do enough, but Vice President Harris can be the technological president. She can, leverage the work that she's done on AI to focus on, blockchain, on cryptocurrency, but also to focus on the micro issues that small businesses and entrepreneurs need. Because at the end of the day, small businesses and entrepreneurs are still the backbone of America's economy.
Very well said. That's what we often say, right? Focus on what people need. And the reality is over 99% of the businesses in the US are SMBs, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to empower growth for the economy and we want to empower growth for those who are underrepresented, focusing on what they need seems like a common sense approach.
Yeah.
But then what do I know? Anyway, I am sure we are going to be very, very, very busy for the rest of the year, but I can't wait to actually catch up with you when you're back from the vineyard and we'll share another lunch together.
Yeah.
Until then, thank you so much for joining me and thank you for joining us for another episode of One Vision. And we'll all talk to you all next week.